Hello and welcome back. This week we're going over Module 1. It has 6 articles. They're designed to give you a sense of critical thinking and critical analysis. Now I'll tackle these articles in the order of assigned reading, but first, what are critical thinking and critical analysis? Critical thinking is the approach to processing and organizing information, which is geared towards weeding out bad information and recognizing parts that work. This approach dissects ideas and gives you a strong overview of what's happening and how the various parts of a claim are supposed to work together. Critical analysis, on the other hand, is about using that critical thinking dissection and then systematically going after every weakness and implication of a claim with surgical precision and seeing if the finished product is functional or garbage. The difference between the two lies in the fact that you can think someone is making stupid claims but not say it. Maybe you don't want to ruin a Thanksgiving dinner. In the analysis portion, your job is to bring out the stupid in all its glory and tear that claim to shreds. Alright, now that we know where we're headed, we just have a small side note to make regarding the topics, language, examples, and questions that we use in philosophy. Philosophers are concerned with understanding ideas, not just nice ideas or cute ideas or ideas that make us feel warm and fuzzy. All ideas are equally on the table. But to understand the idea, you have to be willing to engage it seriously. And that means that while we're going after an idea, we have to suspend our moral judgment. This lets us ask all kinds of otherwise inappropriate questions and give all kinds of dark examples. It's pretty common that a philosopher goes straight for the most extreme case because that's where most ideas break. And these extreme cases tend to include things like murder, rape, genocide, things of that nature. Now, all this is to say that in order to think, we have to be willing to ask the kinds of questions that are normally not on the table. Questions like, what's wrong with rape? Or, were the Nazis right? Or, why can't I eat babies? Now, we don't ask these questions out of the blue. We ask them when they might help us understand an issue better. For example, understanding what's wrong with Nazis is important. You can't just say that it's wrong and call it a day, because the next generation of Nazis are not likely to show up goose-stepping with swastikas. By asking questions, we understand what the idea of Nazism actually is, what kinds of ideas led to it, the context in which it was allowed to develop, etc. None of this means that we're asking the question so that we can go join the Nazis or baby eaters. That's the point of the original idea of safe space at a college level. It was intended as a space where you could safely examine ideas that are normally too toxic to consider. A decent analogy is the fume hood in chemistry labs. You use it to keep the poison of the experiment away from the people conducting the experiment. This allows us to do so much more than we otherwise could. In the same way, the philosophy class is the fume hood for ideas. In here, we get to deal with toxic ideas and we can examine them because the class structure allows us to contain the dangers so they don't spill out into the streets. And just like chemistry, we can create all kinds of cool new things because of this feature. So to reiterate, safe space in our context means safe to ask questions and examine ideas in a completely open way where we don't have to worry about whether somebody's feelings are going to get hurt. Now, your feelings shouldn't be getting hurt because we're talking about a bunch of hypotheticals and we're digging into ideas. Alright, on to the readings. So first up is the reaction versus response article. It sums up as reactions are bad, responses are good. When we take our time to examine what is said, what it means, and then formulate our response, we get actual answers. Otherwise, the whole attempt at a conversation quickly devolves into a shouting match. The trick is, you have to legitimately listen to the other side, no matter what they're saying, no matter what you feel like emotionally. After you listen, you have to ask a bunch of follow-up questions in a non-combative way, and these are supposed to clarify the whole position as best they can. By the way, this alone tends to get people to calm down if you're actually engaged in listening and they can see that you're paying attention. Now, once you have the whole picture, then you can turn around and see how it does and doesn't work. The procedure for doing this is found throughout the rest of the readings. Being a student. Well, being a student is not a matter of attending school. It's a matter of acting a certain way. Plenty of so-called students are not students in any meaningful way. If you sign up for classes and then act in a way that means that you will fail or barely pass or will not retain the information, you're not a student, you're attending school. That's a completely different issue. The ideas presented in this article are the most crucial and functional ones for success that I can find. Of course, there are other things in play, like IQ and luck, but you don't really have any control over that, so it's not something that you can do. But these 10 rules here are about doing your part. Most students who fail or who end up being mediocre at school and thus on their jobs are the ones who have not actually done their part. To be sure, doing your part is difficult. It requires you to sacrifice time. It requires you to sacrifice other activities. But that's the cost of being a student and developing your skills. The same, by the way, is true of any activity. If you want to work out, you have to give up whatever else you would have been doing at that time. And you clearly like the other activity, which is why you were doing it to begin with. But the people who are truly students tend to excel and find that doors will magically open for them. When you are good at what you do, people want to have you do the work. No one wants to go to the doctor who finished last in his class, even though someone had to finish last. Now, you may be thinking, what about picking an instructor? I have no control over that. Well, you do have some control, and you do have a lot of resources to check the kind of instructor you can pick. There's the Rate My Professor kind of websites and other students and plenty of other ways to make a selection. Now, of course, you may have seriously restricted ability in your choice since you only have professors at that particular school and you may have time constraints. But if you're looking to take the advice seriously, then your job is to do the best you can with the possibilities you have. That may mean that you don't have a choice this semester, or that you should delay some particular class until next semester. But nothing on this list is intended as an absolute. You can focus on what you can control, and the rest of it is out of your hands. Do the part that's up to you. Context. The only way to understand what you're dealing with, what ideas mean, is to examine them in context. That context is best understood in those 6 categories listed in the article, namely speaker, audience, content, method, general context, and intent. If you know the answers to these questions, you will have a much easier time understanding an idea and getting it right, and will be much less likely to get offended or go all fake news on the rest of us. It's easy enough to show half a picture, and pretty soon we'll all be at each other's throats because we're both wrong. If you don't have the context, you are wrong, even if you were right. You are wrong because your conclusion is based on guessing and bias and not on knowing the whole picture. These days, everyone is pushing for social media companies to fact-check the things people are sharing, and we're acting like it's the responsibility of the universe to make sure the ideas we get are checked and true, or at least that they agree with what we think anyway. But that's not how reality works. People do what they do because it benefits them. It gets them the likes or the views or the audiences to spell ad space for. It doesn't matter. People will do whatever they think is in their interest. Our job is to make sure that we only believe things that we have a very good reason for believing. That means we are responsible for our own understanding of context and the way we get our information. There's no use blaming it on fake news when you're the one who ends up believing and acting out less than intelligent ideas. Now you can think of this in the following way. Even the biblical Satan has a job. That job is to trip people up so they end up in hell. Now you can't show up and say, Satan made me do it. Blaming someone else for your action did not fly with your parents, it won't fly with your employer, and it doesn't work in the sense of context either. If Satan has a job, so do you. Don't get tripped up. You are the only one responsible for you, what you believe, and what you do. Now to give you an idea of what context does, here is a picture of 69 pixels. Ask yourself just how much can you figure out about the rest of the picture from this. Take all the time you want. Alright, now here's the full image. As you can see, without the context of the whole image, you have no clue what's going on. In fact, you could have taken a month or so to do a full analysis on the 69 pixels, and you can come back with all sorts of very interesting information about the colors that are there and the vertical order of those colors, etc., and it will still be meaningless without this context. Our next article, Decontextualization, shows us the idea of charitable reading, reasons behind uncharitable reading, and gives us 3 examples of how the lack of context twists the argument into something that can't remotely be true. Now, I want to focus on one of these very quickly because it happens to be part of my area of expertise, and it helps illustrate a point regarding the kind of language we use. So we have this claim that religion causes wars, and it's interesting because it has 2 absolute claims in a 3-word sentence. Let me explain what's happening, because neither of these absolute claims use words like always, never, must, and can. Instead, what you have here is the word religion. Because the word religion is not limited in any way, it means all religions, all the time, everywhere, and for the rest of time. So if I invented a religion right now, apparently that would cause wars. The statement is all-inclusive because there are no limits placed on it. And as you saw from the explanation of why this claim doesn't work, so long as there is one religion that does not cause wars, the entire claim goes out the window. The second absolute term is causes. Now, causality means necessarily brings about as a result of existing. So there is no possible scenario where religion does not equal war. Again, this is badly phrased for all the obvious reasons. And it's this kind of language that we really have to beware as we are reading, because decontextualization happens in word choice as well. Zhengming. Zhengming is a fairly important concept because we are very quick to make assumptions and pass judgment on the basis of superficial ideas and understanding. Zhengming requires us to define what our words are supposed to mean, and to do so very, very precisely. We can't just rely on a general sense of what it's supposed to mean. For example, because it happens to be a fairly prominent phrase these days, "not my president" line is a fairly meaningless one. Although it has been in use since about 2004 and has gone through 2 other presidencies, it is unclear what is meant by that. I mean, not your president how? He literally is. Not yours in the sense that you didn't vote for that candidate? Well, that's the case for almost half the country in every election. Not your president because they have a stance that you don't agree with? Again, that's every president we've had. I mean, by that line of argument, every president is not my president, so long as I have any point of disagreement. Additionally, what is this statement supposed to mean? That you are justified in disobeying the law? That you are not bound by the position of that elected office? Are you willing to try that out on a cop? Next time you get a speeding ticket, throw it back at the cop and tell him that they're, quote, not your cop, and see how well that works. Being clear in our ideas requires that we are clear on our terminology and what exactly we mean when we say these words. It's also worth pointing out that these statements have some very dire implications. If we think that because we strongly disagree with a person in a position that we can disregard them, then what we're saying is something like, the elected position of the president can be ignored and rules may be rejected if I feel that the values and ideas of the person elected do not match my own. To begin with, if you make that claim, then everyone gets to make it as well. That means that when someone you like gets into power, you can expect the same treatment by the other side. Kind of counterproductive, isn't it? Additionally, it's a very short distance from this idea to the use of violence for political purposes. We have seen this all over the place. That, by the way, would collapse the entire basis for American democracy, whose key feature is the respect for law and peaceful transition of power based on voting, not on violence. Now, once we have clearly defined what we mean by certain words, we have to figure out what things out in the world match onto these definitions. And to do that, we need Wu Wei. Wu Wei is all about letting things show you what they are and not projecting your ideas onto them. Essentially, it's an approach that says that when you're trying to figure out what a thing is, you have to suspend your use of stereotypes. Now, stereotypes are highly useful and are not inherently bad. They are just mental shortcuts that let us interact with the world without having to focus on it. And we do this so that we can focus on things that matter to us more. Stereotypes also let us make speedy judgments about possibly dangerous situations so that we're less likely to be eaten. Essentially, stereotypes are statistical generalities, which is generalized ideas about large groups of things. In most cases, so long as our ideas are not entirely baseless, and we stay in the field of generalizations, we're doing fine. The problem arises when you try to use baseless ideas or when you try to apply that statistical model to an individual. Think of it this way. No family has 2.4 children. That's because people are counted in whole numbers. You have a person or you have a corpse that happens to be missing pieces. But the average American household has 2.4 kids. As a general population statistic, that's perfectly fine and understandable. But if you try to apply that to an individual family, things get very weird very quickly. As a different example, you use stereotypes for repetitive actions and situations. You stereotype the items in your grocery store all the time. White gallon-sized box in this part of the store is milk. But when is the last time you checked the ingredients to make sure that it's actually milk? It seems silly, right? But you do this because reading the labels would take forever. So you stereotype places, items, people, etc. You stereotype people who look a certain way. A person at Home Depot wearing an orange apron or something that looks like it is stereotyped to be a Home Depot employee. Why don't you ask every person dressed that way if they're an employee first, and then ask your questions? Because that takes too long, and the generalization shortcut works well enough. Occasionally, yes, we make mistakes, but the cost of those mistakes is too low to register. These generalizations are, in essence, like things you see in your peripheral vision but don't focus on. That means that you have a general sense of what they are and what they look like without getting a kind of clear picture you would if you fully focus your attention on it. Stereotypes help keep us alive. If you walk out and you see a tiger, your reaction should be something like, "Ah!" and running away. And if you were asked to explain yourself, you would give us some kind of a tiger stereotype. Tigers can and do kill people, for example. And if you gave us that stereotype, no one would think that you were anti-tiger, and we wouldn't crucify you on social media for being intolerant to large feline Americans. On the other hand, if you saw that tiger and decided not to stereotype it, you would have to go and check if it was a killing machine by putting yourself at mortal risk. And if the tiger ate you, the rest of us would have to admit that you really did it to yourself. No one would come out with #NotMyTiger. As great as these speedy decision-making processes can be in emergencies and in super repetitive situations, we need to put them on hold in certain other situations. We do this so that we can really focus in on the object of interest. And to do that, we need to temporarily shelf our preconceptions and just pay attention. This is a crucial part of solving problems. If you just went by what you assumed was true all the time, you'd miss all the space to challenge and change it. By turning our focus on an object and pausing the generalized understanding, we can get a deeper insight into what's actually going on. This is what we do for French, for example, because we need a personal connection for that relationship to work. And that kind of relationship cannot be attained by generalizations. It's also what we do when a repetitive process goes wrong. Suddenly, instead of a blurry image being good enough, we have to turn all of our attention to the object to see why it's not behaving as we expected it to. Now, when you combine Zhang Ming and Wu Wei, what you have is a very powerful tool that teaches you how to properly define the world and then step back and observe it to see what's what. By doing this, we avoid mistakenly representing people by the titles that they happen to have, which means that we actually get a much better way of understanding what's going on. Finally, we have the reading on the context toolbox. This fleshes out the general context part of the 6 questions in the context reading. These questions are crucial for understanding what's actually being said, what that means, and the kind of proof needed and available. The toolbox gives us a way of coming to grips with other people's ideas, not turning it into fake news, seeing the implications of the claim, finding the functional limits of the claim and allowing us to understand those ideas fully, whether they're right or wrong. Critically, they also allow us to determine if the idea is right or wrong by pointing out the flaws in their claim. By using this approach, we have the tools to respond instead of reacting. We have a reliable way of taking a claim apart, testing what works and what doesn't, and then we can learn from the claim by keeping what works and throwing away the rest. The first 5 questions of the toolbox are about clarifying what's being said. By asking these questions, we confirm that our understanding of the claim is legitimate, and so we stop the spread of fake news by misreporting others. The next 4 questions are about figuring out the implications and limits of a claim. Implications are the consequences of believing something, which are not always immediately obvious. That's why we ask the if-then questions to see some of those implications. The limits are the constraints on the situations where the claim would work. So for example, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, but that's not always the case. Because the boiling point depends on things like pressure, water boils at 95 Celsius in Denver. So the original claim is limited by the context of being at sea level with the average pressure of 1 atm. These limits can then make or break a claim depending on what conditions must be met. For example, I give you the claim that if you buy a lottery ticket, you will win $1 million. Seems like a great deal. But the limiting conditions are your ticket has to be a winning ticket, and there are 10 million tickets and only one winning ticket. All of a sudden, that's not such a great deal anymore, is it? The last 2 questions let us focus on the evidence needed and available to support the claim. And again, it's very important that we ask these in the proper order, because otherwise we commit all sorts of logical fallacies by twisting the claim and bending over backwards to make it do what we wish it would. When we plug this into the 6 context questions, we get the whole picture of what's going on and whether there's any reason to believe a claim. The takeaway for this week is how to think about ideas, how to understand, how to respond when you find yourself confronted with ideas, whether you agree with them or not. If you can keep these notions and questions in mind as we go forward, the rest of the course will be fairly easy, because you will know exactly how to take apart the claims that are coming your way and see what does and doesn't work. Some of the readings may have difficult concepts, but you'll know how to take them apart and have it make sense to you. Just remember that all these concepts work both ways. You should be checking your ideas even more than anyone else's, because those have a much bigger effect on you. All this is available if you make an effort to reference the ideas from this week's readings as you continue your readings for the rest of this course. After a while, this should become a second nature, and you will simply use serious critical thinking and critical analysis all the time and force yourself to respond rather than react. That's it for this week. The next video will be